Compulsory voting is an important tool in the separation of corporation and state, although it's kind of indirectly one. It's important to note that when we say compulsory voting, it doesn't actually mean that people are forced to vote. It simply means that people are forced to show up to a polling station. They are not required to vote for any political party. There's no mandate to force people to vote. Once people are in the voting booth, they can cast a blank ballot, a donkey vote, whatever you want to call it. You can write a horrible message on it. You can say, these are all bad options. In fact, I would argue that we probably should have an option on every ballot saying something like, none of the above. These are all terrible candidates, something like that. So compulsory voting does not mean you are forced to vote. It means you are forced to show up to a polling station. The thing is that once people show up, they tend to cast a valid ballot and look at the available options and choose one. Or depending on the electoral system, choose a list of them. So that's the first thing. Compulsory voting doesn't mean you're required to vote. You can still cast a blank ballot. You can still write nasty messages to everybody. You don't have to vote. You just have to show up. The second thing to note about compulsory voting is that it must be enforced. People need to know that they will be fined if they don't show up. Now, this fine doesn't have to be very big. It just has to be enforced. It can be the same amount as a moderately priced meal at a restaurant. The important thing is not how big the fine is, because it can be quite small to still be effective. The important thing is that it's enforced, meaning if someone does not show up to a polling station and have their name crossed off, they will be fined. Now remember, it's not forcing people to vote for any of the parties. It's just you are required to show up. That's it. And if you don't, you will pay a small fine. The single most important aspect of compulsory voting, and it's one that is actually not talked about very much, is that it forces politicians to consider the needs of everyone, because they know everyone, practically, will show up to vote. If you think about a voluntary system, what tends to happen is wealthier people vote more frequently than the poor. And this becomes entrenched to the point where politicians know they can disregard the interests and needs of the poor non-voting. Then over time, this leads to political parties favoring the interests of wealthy individuals because they're the ones that show up to vote. So voluntary systems become very, very problematic for this simple reason. Whereas if you have compulsory voting, politicians are forced to consider the needs of everyone. It's just baked into the system. And that's a really good thing. It affects the policy platforms that all political parties bring to elections. It affects what politicians do if they're lucky enough to get into government, because they know the next election will be everyone coming out again. So it's a way of the population holding political parties accountable to a much greater extent than occurs in voluntary systems. If your country doesn't have compulsory voting, which it probably doesn't, and this ever gets proposed, 100% support it. I cannot reinforce this enough. And in case you're wondering what are my qualifications for advocating for compulsory voting, I have a PhD in political science, and my thesis was on the design of electoral systems. Another very important aspect of compulsory voting is that it forces governments to make it easy to vote. The reason for this is that it cannot be possible for citizens to claim, I couldn't vote because whatever reason. Governments need to make it easy, or else people can claim, I couldn't vote because the nearest polling station was hundreds of kilometers away, there were big lineups, whatever. There needs to be absolutely no reason people can't vote. So compulsory voting sets this up. Governments must remove any barrier to being able to vote. This can mean that postal voting is an option. It means that the election should be held on a holiday. It means that pre-voting should occur for weeks prior to election day. It means that polling stations should be open from early in the morning till late in the evening so that people can vote before, during, and after work. When all of these things are in place and it becomes very, very easy to vote for everyone, there is rarely a lineup. In compulsory voting systems that work well, you show up and you vote and the entire affair is finished in minutes, not hours. It's usually in and out. You show up, get your name crossed off, take your ballot over to a voting booth, do your thing, and put it in the box, and you can be in and out in 5 minutes. This is how compulsory voting works. Because there are more polling stations, they're open more. Voting is spread out over more locations, over more time, so there are very rarely lineups. Generally, the only lineup is on election day. So for those people who do wait for election day, there can be lineups. But the option to vote before the election, by mail, those make it easy. By the way, it should be mentioned here in the context of making elections and voting easy that we absolutely should not vote online. That's still not secure. But mail-in ballots are secure. All other forms of in-person voting are secure, generally speaking. But the internet is still hackable, and unfortunately, because it would be very convenient, unfortunately, online voting is not secure. So don't support anyone who wants to make your electoral system electronic or online. But we can make voting easy by having extended hour polling stations over many weeks and having more stations available. And mail-in ballots. It makes it easy enough. An accidental benefit of compulsory voting is that it makes people more informed. And the reason for this is that in a compulsory system, people know that they're probably going to vote. And so rather than ignore politics and check out, become apathetic, if people know, yeah, they're probably going to go to the polling station at some point and vote during this election, people tend to pay a little bit more attention. They figure, if I'm going to go through the effort to go there and cast a ballot, I should at least maybe put a little bit of time and consideration into what my decision will be. And so as an accidental side benefit of compulsory voting, you have a more informed electorate, which is a good thing for a democracy. In a compulsory voting system, governments have a better mandate, generally speaking. So if you think about it, in a voluntary system where maybe only 60% of the population votes, then what about that other 40%? We have to sort of guess about, were they just busy, or did they just really not want to vote and they don't think any of the options are good, which kind of challenges the legitimacy of the entire government that gets elected. This is especially true when a government does not get elected on an absolute majority of 50 plus 1%. But with a compulsory voting system where usually you'll see 95 plus % of the population voting and actually casting valid votes, then when a government wins, we can be fairly certain that they have a mandate from the population. Now, one important caveat there is, what if you're forced to vote and you don't like any of the options? Well, you can cast a blank ballot, and if enough people do this, it sends a clear signal to government or to society that the options available are inadequate and need improving. It also sends a clear message to potential new political parties and new candidates that there are substantial public needs that are going unmet by the existing political party platforms and offerings. So either way, it's good to have compulsory voting. Either you get a good mandate for the government that wins, or if there's a very high percentage of invalid ballots, it sends a clear signal to all political parties that what they're offering isn't good enough, and this opens up the potential for new candidates, new political parties, and at the very least, the party that won with a poor mandate and many, many invalid ballots doesn't have the mandate and confidence of the public, and they know that, so they will act more cautiously. So compulsory voting provides mandates or sends signals when that mandate is lacking. Whereas in a voluntary system, we are left guessing as to why people didn't vote. An important institutional framework needs to be in place for compulsory voting, and that is a consistently maintained voter registry. When a citizen turns voting age, they need to be automatically put on the voter registry, and that voter registry cannot be purged the way it is in some countries. People cannot be taken off the voter registry. It needs to be very easy to update the registry. So the updating of the voter registry needs to happen automatically. This can be done with information fed in from driver's license registries or home ownership changes or residency changes. You can feed data into the voter registry system from many other sources to keep it updated. The aim is you want a complete list of all potential voters so that when someone shows up, they are already registered, and that is being registered is the default setting. It also is very important that if you move and don't tell the voter registration authority, that you can change your residency on the spot at a polling booth with just some valid government ID. The key features of a good voter registration system are that you are automatically added to the voter registry when you turn of age, whatever that age is. Your information is automatically updated from other sources, and you are able to update your residency and other details at the polling station. You do those three things and you have a voter registry that includes everyone and automatically updates and can be changed as needed if people move during an election. The main criticism of compulsory voting is that it's an infringement of our rights, our right not to vote. But there is something very important to remember here, is that you still have the right not to vote. Compulsory voting is just, you have to show up. You just have to appear and have your name crossed off. It is not requiring anyone to vote. And so yes, compulsory voting is a minor inconvenience to your absolute freedom. But absolute freedom is a delusion of sociopaths and narcissists. If you want to live in a society, you have to do certain things. And to live in a democratic society, I would argue you have to vote. Because if we make voting optional, then it has all kinds of perverse incentive structures for political parties, and it leads to a situation where wealthy, powerful interests dominate politics and manipulate the electoral system to make it hard for poor and marginalized groups to vote, cutting them out of politics. So compulsory voting shorts this circuit out, and it makes it so that everyone votes. This is very important. So the minor inconvenience of being forced to vote or forced just to show up is an incredibly minor inconvenience compared to the massive inconveniences of having our public power taken away from us and having corporate private interests dominate our lives. That's really inconvenient. I mean, what we're talking about is the comparison between the inconvenience of showing up for half an hour every 3 to 5 years versus the inconvenience of having corporations control our food supply and our healthcare and our prison systems and everything else in society and charging us more just to be alive. I'd say that's a bigger inconvenience. And if we add up the time that it takes to vote versus the time that's been stolen from us because corporate power is taking over our political system, then the balance is clearly in favor of, okay, let's just make voting mandatory. And this is a minor inconvenience that we can put up with. So I would say the inconvenience of allowing corporate, wealthy, powerful interests to control our public political decision-making is a much greater inconvenience, and the inconvenience spans far more aspects of our life and is far more detrimental to all of us than the inconvenience of showing up for half an hour every few years. It's not that hard. And so I don't really think this argument of it's an infringement of our rights really has any merit.